All right, let's jump right into it. When we're assessing risk or putting together disclosures in the midstream oil and gas sector, getting the financial reporting right on competitive behavior is absolutely critical. So today, in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how entities must disclose the total monetary losses they've incurred in their presentation currency. Specifically, we'll look at losses stemming from legal proceedings tied to things like pipeline access, price gouging, and other storage regulations.
Think about it for a second. How do you actually measure fair play when you're dealing with a natural monopoly? The midstream industry is completely defined by massive, highly capital-intensive infrastructure. Because of that, companies inherently find themselves in naturally monopolistic positions. And, with that kind of intense market power comes the very real risk of market manipulation. We absolutely have to have a standardized way to measure if a company is abusing that position. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the midstream monopoly risk, then look at the SASB competitive behavior metrics. After that, we'll get into calculating the actual total monetary losses, define the legal scope, and finally wrap up with context and corrective actions. Okay, starting off with Section 1, the midstream monopoly risk. Now, going by the Sustainable Industry Classification System, the midstream oil and gas industry covers the entities that transport or store natural gas, crude oil, and refined petroleum products. And because this massive infrastructure is so localized, these pipelines and terminals basically operate as natural monopolies in their specific regions. That right there is exactly why these strict competitive regulations are triggered in the first place. And we're not just talking about some niche optional guidelines here. These metrics carry serious global weight. Back in August 2022, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, actually assumed responsibility for the SASB standards, meaning they're now stewarded by the IFRS Foundation. So the metrics we're discussing are fully integrated into a massive global push for transparency and sustainability-related financial reporting. Moving right along to Section 2, SASB Competitive Behavior Metrics. If you're going to remember just one standard code from this explainer, make it EMMD 52A0.1. This is the core quantitative metric that tells midstream entities exactly how to report their total monetary losses from legal proceedings tied to competitive behavior. So, what specific behaviors are we talking about? Well, the regulations are there to make sure midstream companies aren't abusing their dominance. If an entity faces legal action, this metric requires you to disclose it if the case involves unfair rates charged, restricting common carrier pipeline access, price gouging, or price fixing. These specific actions are targeted because they can severely impact consumers and literally distort the broader oil and gas markets. Which brings us to Section 3, calculating total monetary losses. This is the absolute core of the reporting metric. You have to disclose the total amount of monetary losses incurred during the reporting period, and it must be stated in your entity's presentation currency. We're not talking about estimating some future hypothetical impact here. This is about hard, actual financial losses incurred right now, on the books, during the specific cycle, tied directly to those storage regulations and pipeline access disputes we just mentioned. Now, pay close attention here, because the standard sets a very strict boundary for this calculation. What's in scope? Civil judgments, settlements, fines, regulatory penalties, and restitution. But, and this is absolutely crucial, you have to explicitly exclude your own legal defense fees and expenses from that total. The metric is designed purely to show the direct penalty of the anti-competitive behavior itself, not how much it cost your lawyers to fight the case. Let's dig a little deeper in Section 4. Defining the legal scope. The legal scope here is incredibly broad. Basically, the standard says that any adjudicative proceeding involving your entity is captured. It really doesn't matter if you're standing before a traditional court, a specialized industry regulator, or an independent arbitrator. Whether it's a civil action that ends in a settlement, a regulatory action that slaps you with a penalty, or even a criminal action. If it results in a liability related to competitive behavior, you've got to disclose it. And finally, Section 5, context and corrective actions. Look, a massive fine on the books is obviously a red flag. But for investors, that number alone doesn't tell the whole story. They need the why and the what next. That's why the standard demands a brief narrative to go along with the numbers. First, you describe the nature of the loss, like was it a settlement or an outright guilty plea? Second, you explain the context. Was this about price fixing, or did you deny a competitor pipeline access? And third, you have to detail the corrective actions you've taken. Because ultimately, how are you going to prevent these market distortions from happening again?
You have to spell out the exact operational or structural changes you've implemented since the fine. Did you restructure management? Did you update your internal processes or drop some problematic business partners? Maybe you rolled out brand new compliance training or upgraded your tech to ensure fair pricing. Adding this context transforms a static penalty number into a really dynamic view of how a company handles its regulatory risks.
So let's leave off with a bit of a provocative question. If the financial hit from an anti-competitive penalty is just treated internally as the cost of doing business, what is that actually signaling to your investors who are trying to assess long-term capital risk? By forcing midstream companies to report their total monetary losses in their presentation currency, alongside the real corrective actions they're taking, this standard makes sure bad behavior can't just be swept under the rug. It forces transparency, and at the end of the day, that's what builds investor trust and drives smarter capital allocation.